Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
We understand how this vote, obviously very important to U.S. citizens across the country, really important domestically, and yet the world, too, is getting ready for either a Donald Trump or a Kamala Harris victory.
And that's where we go now. We know both candidates have voiced different views on the role of the U.S. globally. As a reminder, here's Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on the Israel-Hamas war during the September 10th ABC News debate.
She hates Israel. If she's president, I believe that Israel will not exist within 2 years from now. And I've been pretty good at predictions, and I hope I'm wrong about that one.
But the one thing I will assure you always, I will always give Israel the ability to defend itself, in particular as it relates to Iran and any threat that Iran and its proxies pose to Israel. But we must have a two-state solution.
That was both candidates at their one and only presidential debate. A reminder, it was hosted by ABC News back in September.
All right, so Tim, our own team out with one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg today. It's also the Bloomberg Big Take, which means our editorial team thinks it is a must-read for folks out there. The story reports that the world is fixated on the result of today's vote. Even if Washington doesn't call the shots anymore, it still calls plenty. So let's get into it with Bloomberg Economics senior geoeconomic analyst Gerard DiPippo. He joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Gerard, you and your colleagues, you're reporting, you note, America's brief heyday as the world's lone superpower is history, no matter who wins. But the world is fixated on the result of Tuesday's vote. Even if Washington doesn't call the shots anymore, it still calls plenty. So the outcome, no matter what, let's get to this first of all, means a different role for the United States going forward globally?
Yes, part of this are longstanding trends, but if you look at what's happening in the Middle East and especially what's happening in Europe, some trade-offs, particularly with U.S. defense in the Pacific, it's not what it used to be. So it went from the 90s and 2000s when the U.S. was the global hegemon. That is no longer the case. And even if the U.S. technically might have the resources to do certain things, there doesn't seem to be much political will. So even if Harris, for example, supports Ukraine, it's not obvious that even if she wins, that the Senate, if the Republicans control it, would authorize another batch of aid for Ukraine. So ultimately, there are limits to what the U.S. is willing to do. And so it's causing leaders in capitals, particularly in the G7, to wake up to the possibility that maybe the U.S. won't always be there.
What does that mean if the U.S. isn't always there?
Well, I think you have to break it down by region. So take Europe, for example. Europe and NATO has relied on the U.S. defensive umbrella for decades. The U.S. has been calling on them to spend more on defense. They haven't really done so. But if Donald Trump wins, he's much more skeptical about alliances than Harris is, and much more vocal about demanding our allies spend more on defense. So, for example, if Europe tried to match U.S. defense expenditures as your share of its GDP, it would increase Europe's debt by close to $3 trillion in about a decade, right? So this is a big difference in trajectory if the Europeans don't believe that the U.S. is necessarily there to backstop them. If you look at other parts of the world, say, let's take the Middle East, it's more complicated. You just showed the clip during the debate. Actually, in that case, Harris and Trump are not all that far apart. Harris is probably more concerned about humanitarian issues in the Middle East, particularly with Gaza, but they're both quite supportive of Israel. I think the difference is what we're seeing of late, particularly with the conflict with Iran, the U.S. has its limits. And so the Biden administration is doing a lot to try to somehow direct what Israel is doing, but it doesn't control it, right? And so I think people had just made assumptions that the U.S. was sort of calling the shots. And that wasn't really true before, but it's just more evident that it's not true now.
Is it a mistake to think Kamala Harris, Gerard, is just Biden 2.0 when it comes to the world stage?
That's not quite right. So there would be mostly consistency. She's of a different generation. So Biden is very much of the post-World War II order of the U.S. as the world leader, very much committed to that architecture. I think Harris is, but she has, it seems like, a more sort of modest view of what the U.S. can do, which is just more current given those limitations. There's also the fact that because she might be dealing with a Congress that might not be aligned with her, there's only so much she can do in terms of things that require more resources. And the U.S. is facing its own interest rate and debt problems now. So even if she's sort of broadly supportive, it doesn't mean it's going to be a continuation of sort of a strong U.S. policy. And even then, the Biden administration has been, as noted in an article, more or less serving its own interests. Right? They talk a lot about alliances, but it's what the U.S. views as in its own best interest.
You mentioned Congress, and obviously we're focused on the presidential outcome, but we are also talking a lot about the down ballot races and what happens in terms of the composition of the U.S. Congress on the other side of this vote. Talk to us a little bit more about that, how important that is in terms of shaping the U.S. role on the world stage.
So generally speaking, foreign policy is an area where the White House has a lot of autonomy. What you need Congress for is basically budgets and taxation. And if you need something for, say, more defense expenditures, or if she has foreign aid objectives, that's where the congressional collaboration matters more. However, Congress over the past few decades, really 50 years or so, has delegated its taxation authority when it comes to tariffs. So in that case, if Donald Trump wins, he can actually pretty much uniformly impose tariffs if he wants to, using emergency powers. And so it's really on the external side, despite that this election is primarily about domestic issues, social issues, or domestic economic issues, the foreign policy is where you might see actually more volatility. And that's because any president has more leeway in that area.
That's probably a good segue to talk about China and Taiwan. Certainly, the former president has made his view on how he thinks tariffs should be on China and on much of the world. But what would you say the major differences are between a Harris administration and a Trump administration when it comes to dealing with China and Taiwan?
In general, what Trump cares about is trade. He's less concerned with quote, national security issues in the way that most people in Washington would define them. It's more transactional. He's been, let's say, inconsistent about his position on Taiwan. Harris is adhering to the strategic ambiguity, which is itself sort of confusing, but not exactly saying whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan. Trump, bottom line, with Taiwan or even Europe anywhere, he's basically calling for those countries to provide more in terms of their own defense expenditures, buy more goods, and balance trade with the U.S. I think Harris is more sort of the standard, allies and partners, and trying to mitigate the risks of instability in the Taiwan Strait. But I think with China, Trump's overwhelming concern is going to be trade.
One thing I want to ask you, and just got about 30 seconds left here, Gerard, is migration, but you really tie it specifically, obviously, to Latin America. And I wonder if there are other countries that are dealing with their own migration issues. So I'm just curious how that plays globally and why that's important. And again, just got about 30 seconds here.
So for the U.S., if Trump does what he says he's going to do, which is to deport a large share of undocumented workers or immigrants, that would result in quite the economic shock. So Bloomberg Economics estimates that if Trump were to deport basically all the undocumenteds who came in after 2020, that would put a 3% of GDP hole in the U.S. economy by 2028. That would have major effects on the region, particularly for remittances, so Mexico, Guatemala, et cetera. These are countries that rely largely on what their workers in the U.S. are sending back. And so it does have a lot of ripple effects. And I think when it comes to Latin America, migration and trade will be the two biggest issues should Trump win.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Gerard DiPippo, Bloomberg Economic Senior Geoeconomic Analyst.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Well, in the last block, we talked about how the world is prepping for the outcome of the U.S. presidential race. In shorthand, it means a win by Kamala Harris represents continuity, and a win by Donald Trump means chaos, at least according to our team. A deeper realization, though, is also taking hold in key capitals, and that is America's brief heyday as the world's lone superpower is history, no matter who wins. We just heard that from our own Gerard DiPippo.
Well, our next guest notes that, quote, "We are about to experience the most dysfunctional domestic political fight of the world's advanced industrial democracy." So let's get to the interview. We've got with us from New York City, the founder and president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media, Ian Bremmer. Ian, good to see you this afternoon. Look, I want to start with the good news here. You do write that we are about to experience the most dysfunctional domestic political fight of the world's advanced industrial democracies, but you also say that we are the gold standard of elections. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in terms of how the election is actually conducted, there's been plenty of audits. You don't see people that are supposed to be off the rolls, on the rolls. Georgia recently, this was bipartisan, 8 million registered voters, 20 non-citizens were actually registered. There's no capacity. You've got no online voting, so you don't have cyber issues. The efforts to interfere with these elections, both internal and external, have consistently been shown to be false. And the courts, independent courts, have upheld that. So our problem is one of mistrust. Our problem is one of illegitimacy. Our problem is not one of the elections themselves. And I think that we will see that over the course of the day.
It's a problem of external interference. And I wonder about that. We continue, Ian, to watch the evolution of warfare globally, whether it's moved from, on the ground combat to missiles in the air or drones to cyber warfare to also, I think it's safe to say, election interference warfare. Talk to us about that and your concerns there.
There are 3 countries, adversaries of the United States, that are really actively trying to interfere in U.S. elections. They all share one goal, which is that they want the United States to mistrust its own political institutions. They want more chaos in the United States. They want the U.S. to be weaker. But what they're trying to accomplish is actually very different. It's Russia. It's Iran, and it's China. Russia's interference has overwhelmingly been in favor of Trump. They really want Harris to lose. They think they'll have a much better shot of resolving the Ukraine war in their favor if Trump is the president. The Iranians, who really want Harris to win, they actually, in addition to interference and also leaking all sorts of classified, components of the Trump campaign that they wanted the U.S. media to run with, they've also tried to assassinate Trump and members of Trump's cabinet, like Mike Pompeo. And I'm kind of stunned that hasn't gotten more media attention, frankly. And then you've got the Chinese, who, of course, are much more involved just in collecting intelligence on everybody involved in the election. But their interference has been mostly on the down ballot in Congress, where they feel like no matter what they do, they're dealing with a very, very strong and bipartisan anti-China sentiment. And they're trying to put their thumb on the scale in favor of those few that are running in Congress that move in the other direction.
What's more worrisome to you, though, that election interference, which I think it's safe to assume that I'm assuming the U.S. is interfering maybe also in other elections? I don't know. I'm just, in terms of...
You mean the Russian elections and the Chinese elections? I mean, if the Chinese had elections, I'm sure we would try to interfere with them. They don't. Russia does have elections, but it's pretty sure that if you're actual opposition, you're thrown out of the window. So, I mean, the point is we do engage in espionage.
Right.
But a democracy, especially a democracy that is in crisis, is more vulnerable to interference from adversaries. And absolutely, the biggest danger is internal. If the Americans weren't so willing to think that their enemies are inside their own country, our real enemies would have much less capacity to undermine us. But they are taking advantage of our vulnerabilities and our political dysfunction.
So, in your role at Eurasia Group, you speak to a lot of executives, business leaders constantly. What are you hearing from them? Who do they want to win, and what are their concerns with either candidate coming out victorious?
Well, I'll tell you, the first point is that they really don't want a month or two of uncertainty. They don't want the U.S. election to descend into chaos. They don't want it to be, sort of a confrontational non-outcome. So they would, most executives I know would rather this be a landslide win for either side. than have this be something that a lot of people don't believe in the outcome and the legitimacy of the outcome. In terms of different leaders, I think it really depends on what sector you're in, and it also depends on what part of the world you're in. I mean, there are definitely sectors that have a strong preference for Trump, and not surprisingly, I mean, if you're like in the oil and gas sector in the U.S. or you're crypto, or even I would say in a lot of the financial execs, you're seeing that Trump's orientation in favor of your sector, and in opposed to regulation on your sector makes you generally happier with him. I would say most of big tech is more comfortable with Harris, and that's the biggest component, of course, of where the U.S. Markets are right now. A lot of the big industrials are also, on balance, more comfortable with Harris. And then, depending on different parts of the world, they're oriented more towards things that really matter in their neighborhood. So, I mean, the European executives are much more comfortable with Harris and generally oppose Trump because they're worried about the U.S.-European relationship. They're worried about tariffs on Europe. They're worried about Trump cutting, Ukraine loose and having the Europeans be forced to pay for everything under a lot more pressure. So it's not easy to say, oh, the business community likes this or likes that. It's really much more complicated than that.
And no doubt about it, whether you like or dislike Donald Trump, I think many agree that he has changed politics in America, maybe forever. And we know the rise of populism is not just a U.S. thing, it's a global thing. A win by Donald Trump means what for politics in America? A loss by Donald Trump means what for politics in America, in your view?
For politics, I think a win by Donald Trump is different this time than in 2017 when he became president, because if he loses, he's probably going to jail. And he does understand that there are lots of adversaries that don't just want him to lose, but they want him behind bars. And I think his willingness to take them on, and therefore politicize and even weaponize the domestic institutions that facilitate that, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS, I think that's a meaningful risk in a way that it wasn't back in 2017. This wasn't a priority for Trump at all. And if he were to do that, that would have a chilling effect on rule of law. It wouldn't make the U.S. into a dictatorship. It wouldn't lead to show trials. I'm not trying to make this to make this sound extreme, but I think for many around the world that count on the United States to be consistent in its application of law over time, the fact that the U.S. would become more of a hybrid political system, the most powerful country in the world, but with a political system that democratically feels more like a Hungary than it does a Japan or a South Korea, I think that would be meaningful. And long term, I think it would erode confidence in the United States. So that's what I think a win by Donald Trump in this maximally divided environment would mean. A loss, I think you would still have the Republican Party orient on a lot of populist measures because they're very popular with the base. I don't think it would go back to the, sort of middle of the road conservative GOP of old. I think it would still be very strong on border security and hostile to illegal immigration. I think it would be more anti-corporate, at least in the top line. And so I don't think the Chamber of Commerce would be super comfortable with them. I think they'd still focus on tariffs. They wouldn't support free trade.
Right.
So I'm not sure the Republican Party would change massively in the event of a Trump loss.
One thing that we wanted to ask you about was the role of billionaires in the context of someone like Elon Musk, especially over the last few weeks, making such a push for one candidate, in this case, Donald Trump. What do you hear from business leaders and CEOs about the role of billionaires in elections right now?
It's way too high, but I mean, of course, you say that, and then you recognize that they're not changing it. The role of money in the American system. This was a $10 billion election, $3.5 billion on the presidential. That is an obscenity. That is the opposite of democracy. That's why so many Americans feel like this election doesn't represent them, and why it doesn't matter who they vote for. A lot of people that feel that way. I don't believe that there's a deep state, but there is an apparatus that, is able to capture the United States called moneyed special interests, and that's true across the board. You couldn't have a $10 billion election if that wasn't true, because you wouldn't spend that kind of money. We know corporates, if they're spending 10 billion, they expect a return on that investment, and I assure you, they're getting it. So that's the problem, but Elon is the most powerful billionaire. But on balance, more of the big money actually went to more billionaires donated to Harris this time around than donated to Trump. The totals are obscene.
Hey, just 10 seconds. Risk to financial markets depending on the outcome, and just briefly, if you could.
Probably a little higher near term on the Harris side, just because you would have more regulatory enforcement. So that's why the bankers on balance near term like Trump.
So appreciate it. A thoughtful voice who gets it and makes the connection between politics and markets and really the world order. Ian, thank you so much. Ian Bremmer, founder and president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As we mentioned, it's not just about the presidential election. The battle for control of the U.S. Congress has topped $10 billion as the two parties vie for outsized influence over taxes, spending, and the implementation of the next president's agenda. Billy House is Bloomberg News congressional reporter. He joins us from Omaha, Nebraska. Billy, you're in Nebraska, I would imagine, because there's this wild card race taking place there where independent union leader Dan Osborne has been running neck and neck with incumbent Republican Deb Fischer. It could also scramble the outcome on election night. Talk about the stakes here and the two individuals involved.
Well, sure. There's veteran senator, two-term Senator Deb Fischer is facing a tough race by a candidate who calls himself an independent, though Republicans say they think he's a Democrat in sheep's clothing. But at issue here is if he manages to pull this upset off tonight, all the numbers in the Senate about what Republicans need to take that chamber back are going to be askew, and we could have a tied chamber. And of course, the vice president, whichever party that would come from, would then actually technically be the tie-cast breaking vote. But this is Omaha and Nebraska's second congressional district, and there are other things at play here, and a stray electoral vote in the presidential race in which some scenarios say could be used to either win the race, should Harris take it, or block Harris's route to 270 if Donald Trump can win this district. And then there's, of course, the congressional race itself here that is among the crucial pivotal races for control of the U.S. House. Okay. A lot of things happening here in Omaha.
Explain what's going on here, because
people who are listening are being like, what did he say? Stray electoral vote here?
It's one of two states that breaks down, that separates electoral votes in this way, and has different districts, right? So talk about what can happen in Nebraska.
It's called the blue dot. I'm sitting in the blue dot of Omaha and its suburbs. And there are blue dot signs everywhere. Harris has vastly outspent Trump. And the thing is, there are scenarios, and they're very solid scenarios, that it could come down to one vote, whether Harris can get 270, the amount needed to win the presidency. And this could be the district that could be used to block her, keep her at 269, and therefore send the whole contest, the whole kit and caboodle, to the U.S. House. So that's what we're watching here tonight. It may not come to that. Things may work itself out before Nebraska, but when the polls close here at 9 o'clock Eastern time, all eyes are going to be on who actually won this one of three Nebraska districts in a sea of red.
Just when you thought it couldn't get more interesting, Billy, it certainly does. Having said that, we talk so much about the presidential race, but as you know, the makeup, the composition of the U.S. Congress is also important. And I also think about, if it's a tight race, who ultimately comes into Congress January 1st, in particular the House of Representatives, could be important too, yes?
Well, absolutely. The other element about Omaha, the most popular place on earth lately is that Speaker Johnson's been here 3 times in recent weeks. Hakeem Jeffries, the top Democrat in the U.S. House, has been here. And they're all fighting for this congressional district now held by 4-term Republican Don Bacon, who's almost lost 2 other previous runs. Jeffries and Democrats only need a net gain of 4 seats nationally to take the U.S. House, take it back. They lost it 2 years ago. And Don Bacon's seat here in Omaha is a pivotal, crucial target for Democrats to achieve that.
When do we've been talking to our folks on the ground about timing quite a bit, Billy. We just spoke to Brennan out in Arizona earlier. We were talking to Romaine in Michigan. What's timing like for Nebraska counting these votes?
I was with election officials this morning. They do not think there's going to be any problems, but you never expect them until they happen. They have security people ready to go. The Secretary of State's ready to go here on counting. But they think results will be ready by 9 o'clock Eastern time in all those races, the Senate, U.S. House, and the presidential results from this congressional district. The thing with the presidential race, though, the results might be in Omaha, but you won't know how important they are until results elsewhere in the country come in later.
That's a really good point. Gosh, it just gets crazier and more interesting. Hey, Billy, one of the things we were thinking about as we were getting ready to talk to you, we always love it. You understand the U.S. Congress like no other. Having said that, we all remember being live on air as January 6th unfolded, and we tapped into you to kind of get an idea of what was happening. How are you thinking about looking back at where we were, where we are today, where we might be going when it comes to U.S. politics, the role of Congress in it all, and that day, a few years ago?
Thanks for the lovely memory of me being locked in the U.S. House chamber.
Yikes.
Rioters breaking glass and members of Congress next to me crying. But yes, the House and Senate this year, earlier this year, passed new rules for certifying the presidential race. And the idea is that those will help make things go a little smoother that day, and there will be no questions about what the vice president can unilaterally do or whatever. But again, if there's a real challenge, a real upset over the results, and somebody wants to stop what's happening, it's unclear what Speaker Mike Johnson might do, or Republicans. And so there's rules in place to prevent what happened from happening again. Whether they're followed is, the same question as whether rules were followed on January 6th. Not really.
Yeah. And again, the composition of the U.S. Congress, right? If the Democrats are in the House, right? That also just reminds you how important that outcome is as well. Just quickly.
Right. The Congress that will decide if the U.S. president's race goes to the Congress that will decide it will be the new Congress.
Right.
There are issues about whether they could be sworn in and fast enough. That's the thing.
Good to know. Good to know. Hey, you rock. Lean on you so much. We really appreciate it. Billy House, congressional reporter at Bloomberg News, right there in Omaha, Nebraska.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, about 18 minutes to go until we wrap up the trade on this election day 2024. And we see stocks up. We were just talking about it with our Bill Maloney that, kind of seen a little bit of a Trump trade in terms of stocks up. We've seen crypto up. We've seen, a trade where the markets have moved when there are expectations of a Donald Trump second term in the White House. So we shall see. Well, his own stock, Trump Media and Technology, this one's been bouncing around. Right now it's a little bit higher, but it's been off, it's been higher, it's been a lot of volatility today. We've even seen the stock halted in terms of trading a couple times. So interesting day, and we'll see. And maybe this is really what a close race looks like in terms of the trade.
Nobody knows anything.
Nobody knows anything. Maybe Emily Roland knows something.
She's co-chief investment strategist at John Hancock Investment Management. Emily, good to have you with us. What might tomorrow's trade look like?
Oh gosh, we're still in wait and see mode here, and we don't know how much we're going to know tomorrow. So I think, investors are still on edge. I think markets, today not only reflected maybe some of that Trump trade, but today we also saw that blowout ISM services data showing up very much in expansionary territory, improvement on both the employment and the inflation front. So I think that was one thing that kind of contributed to the soft landing or no landing narrative that's been pervading markets as of late. Interesting that we saw bond yields rising on it this morning, but then they fell as we had some pretty solid treasury auctions at play here. So I think markets are contending with so many different factors right now. You pick a narrative, you can go with it. And we'll have to see how all of this unfolds tomorrow.
So a mistake for anybody to say it's a Trump trade today? Do you think it's trading more on fundamentals right now in terms of economic data and treasury auctions?
Yeah, I think your point about crypto was spot on. And I think that's certainly an element that's been associated with the Trump trade. Normally, you would see a more significant backup in bond yields. That's, I think, kind of been the number one element of the Trump trade, not seeing that today. So I do think that there was some focus on the economic data and the fundamental backdrop. We're just suggesting that even if this is a sort of protracted period of not knowing the results, that investors try not to make a lot of shifts in terms of positioning right now. We're suggesting that we manage risks. Investors try to put together what we're calling a chill portfolio, as we can chill as we get through these election results, which really, again, manages valuation risk on the equity side, focuses on high quality companies that can deliver on earnings, and then on the fixed income side, really targeting the intermediate part of the curve with core or core plus type positioning, again, to manage those tail risks.
I thought a chill portfolio, Carol, would be like a bottle of wine, maybe a pizza.
That's happening tonight too.
Yeah. Like when you say chill around,
that's called my Friday night portfolio.
Maybe I know some people who are tapping into the Xanax these days. I don't know.
Little gummies.
Well, listen, in Massachusetts, not only is marijuana been on the ballot, that's long gone. We're actually, one thing on the ballot here in Massachusetts today was legalizing psychedelics. So that if that's nothing but chill, I think we can consider that as well.
Well, so is there any positioning that you have been doing or suggesting that clients do ahead of the elections, or has it really been a wait and see mode? Or has it been kind of moving things into a little bit of maybe increasingly cash or shorter term investments?
Well, I think we've certainly seen a lot of investors doing that. Cash piles are extremely elevated right now. That's showing us that there's not a lot of excessive optimism in the markets, which frankly is a contrarian indicator suggesting that the bull market still has some legs here. What we've been doing, again, is avoiding the tail. So if you look at, for example, U.S. large cap growth stocks, we're still overweight there, but there's significant valuation risk. The S&P 500 growth index is trading at a 53% premium to its 20-year average. So naturally, you'd want to look to the value side. The challenge there is that we just haven't seen the earnings growth. So then you think, well, maybe I'll move down in market cap to get some protection. But the challenge in the small cap space is a lot of those companies are unprofitable. 40% of the Russell 2000 index doesn't make money. So that's lower quality. So it's bringing us to mid caps. That's the sweet spot to us. They're trading at a significant discount to their large cap counterparts, steepest discount since the late 1990s. I've got an overweight to the industrial sector that's benefiting from the manufacturing renaissance that we're seeing in the United States. And then on the fixed income side, we see high yield bonds being priced for perfection. Right now, spreads are hovering around 275 basis points, well below the 20-year average of 500 basis points. Yes, the economy is doing well, but we think it's in the price on the credit side. And then meanwhile, there are challenges extending duration here, particularly if we do see more fiscal stimulus, more spending coming out of whoever is in office from here.
What happens to the bond market if Trump wins?
Yeah, I mean, I think what investors are pricing in, and we try not to have any conjecture on exactly how these political outcomes are going to play out, but investors have bid up bonds, and there's an idea out there that there could be more fiscal expansion, there could be more deficit spending, maybe reducing taxes or keeping those tax cuts in place could cause a challenge to the deficit, is what investors are telling us in the bond market. So that's something that we're watching really closely here. There's another side to the story, though, which is that the higher bond yields go, the more restrictive mortgage rates and other borrowing costs become. And that actually kind of is a self-fulfilling mechanism that would frankly sort of limit economic activity. So I think that's another kind of side of the story that maybe hasn't been fleshed out quite as much.
What would be a shock to you and maybe some of your clients?
I don't think anything at this point. This has been one of the most volatile elections that we've ever experienced. It just, it feels at this point that there are so many different narratives on the table. The race is so tight. I think the least surprising thing that will happen is that we see volatility across assets tomorrow. I guess maybe the most surprising would be that we see nothing happening at all. Certainly not our base case, but a possibility that's out there.
What about tonight? Do you think things will be decided by the end of the day tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a political strategist, but I listen to a lot of them, and I think the consensus is that we won't know much tonight. Probably the earliest we'll know something is tomorrow morning. The last election, I wasted a lot of time staying up all night waiting for these results to come in. So I think the best strategy for many of us might be to get a little bit of extra sleep, knowing that tomorrow is going to be a big day.
I was trying to tell you
that's
that
why
earlier,
you want to go
Carol.
to sleep. I know.
You were saying you're going to be up all night watching the results. I said, I'm going to go to sleep, and maybe I'll wake up in the middle of the night and look at my phone.
Omaha will know by 9 p.m. ET. There's a lot of things. And the thing is, if it's not a close race, as the polls have suggested, if there is somewhat of a bigger move on either side, we could know a lot earlier, even though some states have to wait a couple of days to kind of make sure they count all of those mail-ins and so on. So just saying. Right. Who knows? As you said, it's been interesting. Lots of surprises. Hey, Emily, take care. Emily Roland, Co-Chief Investment Strategist over at John Hancock.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.